In the latest of these videos, which are a historical record of the proportions events have evolved in over time, I mean in terms of the big picture and its effect on geopolitics. So a rich business person can watch these videos and learn the whole of history from the book, and in learning to see the proportions of the whole, will be able to better protect the overall timescale of global investments, or government people can catch up on what they have missed in their education on the history of the overall framework of nations. The UN system, how the ages change, even though they would have a much better understanding of the workings of the current world system than I have. It is bringing history into the present and seeing its relevance in terms of the way events are currently occurring. In the last 2 weeks, we've had nationwide rioting in Italy and in Brussels, Belgium, where around 500 people took place in a Palestinian demonstration, with numerous others around the world, including about 500 people arrested on 2 occasions for attending rallies in the UK supporting Palestine Action, the banned organisation which exists here. In solidarity, political activists launched the Flotilla of Freedom, which headed east across the Mediterranean to Gaza, protected by warships from Italy, Spain, Turkey and Greece. This was firebombed by drone strikes from the Israeli Navy and ultimately hijacked by Israeli naval commandos and its members deported back to their respective shores. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he will never give up when it comes to protecting human rights and freedom. But this is from MSN.com. He says world leaders must choose between cooperation and chaos. While app.com.pk reports he has warned of relentless suffering and the UN's principles being under siege. UK News at yahoo.com accuses him of failing to respond to the changing world order. So what is the truth in all this? For example, what type of deal have the superpowers, Hamas and the UN, all collectively made over this Palestine situation? Perhaps it's not Russia, but the US and Israel, which supplied the intelligence which led to Hamas attacking the music festival in Israel on October the 7th, 2 years ago. Maybe they deliberately targeted it and then denied it, as certain people in Hamas knew it would lead to the Jewish overreach, then the war in Gaza, then international outcry and the need to create a state of Palestine as the solution. Or maybe they did just come across it by accident. Yet the world moves into another new phase of politics regardless. People start asking a new set of questions and the past once again becomes irrelevant, while national systems of authority continue to train their officials to use the national brainwash trigger words like, in America, we've got a job to do. In Britain, there's something going on, isn't there? Hello. What's all this about? What's all this then? Phrases which relate to the structure of the national psyche and signify superiority and authority and investigation, and if people are seen to be doing something different from other than what is supposed to be happening in the nation or the way that it's supposed to be happening in that nation, then people are allowed to get suspicious. And this creates a kind of power and control system which the world's trying to get away from, but the situation keeps fluctuating. So there's always a rebellion against it, which goes back and forth. And now we're kind of seeing the ultimate one of these in Israel and Palestine, which I think it raises the issue now that it's no longer a case of asymmetric warfare like we allowed in the Cold War, where the situation is allowed to go back and forth between the two sides of the left and the right, or the east and the west, because it's just too much now. It's the situation has got to the point where the issue is being raised by the way that events are occurring. So a lot of people now want to get onto this and look at the structure of global civilization and how it's evolved over time in order to be able to understand the situation we're in now and where it's all going. During the multipolar phase, we've seen the widespread policy of populist politics, and there's been more closely monitored feedback between governments and populations to make people easier to manage, with the compensation coming in terms of an increase in human rights and overall wealth and such like positive factors. While the world order remains at large, while some nations have been perfecting, others have been falling apart. And this has led to the structural issue of the world order as a whole becoming something people are actually becoming more aware of. So given all of the protocols in the world system, will people ever really know the truth about what's happened even just recently if they don't understand how the situation's evolved over time? Because that's really where you can see the angles from, which tell us what must have really happened, and otherwise we just see what the system presents to us on the daily news or what it wants to say. And while this is all very well and good most of the time, it means that people never really get to the bottom of it, and they never really get to full kind of satisfaction in terms of questioning the national psyche or questioning who they are. And only certain individuals kind of reach what we call enlightenment. And it still means a world just for the few and not for the many, because most people never really get to that level, you know? And it just means that everybody's kind of looking for a way to do that without having to go through the whole system of whatever the national thing that they do at the time is, whether it's the Church of England or Buddhism or Shaolin or Hinduism. You have to do the whole thing in order just to reach the idea that really you don't understand it, and it really involves the whole world, and then there's levels that cope with that, and then you become somebody that's kind of so detached from your own national system and the people that you kind of grew up with, so that you, in the end, you just have nothing, and they absorb the problem in this way through these systems, through enabling people to reach a level which is beyond it, and then they don't care about what's happened. So this has got to stop now. At this time, we can see the world beginning to leave the multipolar phase because of the issue now being raised over the world system in general, taking precedence really in the news and in terms of public opinion, which is being carefully guided by the Plan for Nations, which runs through the whole nature of these phases that we're going through. So despite having to manage the situation using government, analysts, intelligence agencies, and negotiators, cultural interpreters, it is being seen, and spin doctors, it is being seen that nations can work together, at least enough to shift the situation away from the confrontation between BRICS and NATO and towards addressing fundamental issues like the rights of nations. In theory, the recognition of Gaza will fill the gap in the rise of the new centre ground, as it will bring it under international law, force Hamas to end, and people to elect a government from a choice of political parties. This government, with the help of international support, will hopefully be able to manage its own affairs in a way which does not bring it into conflict with other nations. The whole problem being that the issue of the world order has brought nations into conflict with each other, and smaller nations have become involved in conflicts between larger nations, ultimately leading to the situation we have now, in which the issue of the world order is rising in the public consciousness because of the way the world is edging its way into the Anthropocene. So, of course, the way social institutions were created in the Holocene is in question. But again, this is all very technical, and only certain people are able to understand it because they're the ones that have gone back into understanding how the structure of the ages is changing. And the fact is that while it would take no more than a few hours for people to actually look at those ideas and understand the whole situation in terms of how it's evolving, in terms of the proportions in which it's evolved over time, people do not see why they need to understand periods of history or geological ages in order to do their job. Hence, the world which will appear will continue to function in a certain way. And it will still be up to the people high up in the intelligence agencies and such like to look into the move order in which nations are interacting to provide governments with the right information to consider realistic possibilities of political progress and political directions for their countries. Even now, it's becoming possible that the world order can be discussed by people at large, though, in terms of how the ages change, which will have an effect on both education and training over time. And I think the new question really is becoming, what sort of timescale are we talking in here for the way that this change comes through? Because it could just happen in an instant with the internet. There is just information everywhere, which people can get their hands on. So do we want to do this in a completely chaotic kind of way, as Guterres said, that we have to choose between coordination and chaos? And that means whether we're going to do this together in an organized way and make sure that everybody gets at least some kind of right idea of it, or are we going to allow the sort of cults and social movements that we saw over the 20th century, only now using the internet to recruit millions of followers online who maybe have no idea what they're a member of or who's leading it or what that leadership is doing? So as I said as far back as video 13, how the philosophy of the postmodern age has already evolved, and we can see how the world we have today is an extension of that. And the world cannot go backwards because of the flow of events over time. We have more experience now than we did yesterday. So history never repeats itself exactly, but we do see certain patterns running through, particularly through the behavior of nations and what nations evolved out of in terms of the way that we're now living in the final nations, or what's known as the final nations, the compartmentalized secular countries that have evolved out of the massive kind of power blocks like the empires of the Middle Ages, like the Christian Europe and the Islamic empires, have settled down into their own compartmentalized nations, which will manage for tax and government purposes. So everybody's kind of a lot more settled, a lot more organized now. We're at the point now where we could have a mass distribution of ideas, and it seems like everyone still wants to be free to do things in exactly their own way, because maybe to compensate for the fact that the world tells them what to do all day. So at the end of the day, they say, right, I'm free, I'm not going to do any of that anymore, I'm going to have my time. And then in the end, the more we learn how the world functions as one, the more I think we want to be a complete person, and we want to be the person at work that we are at home. We want to be the person at home that we are at work, and in this way we become more integrated, and it means that we can achieve a lot more. But still there are a lot of divisions in people's psyches in terms of what they have to do for a living. So the world will appear to continue to work in a certain way, and it will still be up to the people high up in government to manage the people below them, who will be recruiting obviously the people on the street, who will be the people that are picked because they're the best fit for the job. And the way things are going now is enabling organizations to work more closely together and events to run more smoothly, although certain problems which are deeply ingrained into nations are still buried in the system, and certain issues people will have to avoid or get stuck into the quagmire of absurdities which will emerge as they start to question certain things. Societies will have to keep up with the times, as AI is now generating analysis models which are even better than humans' ability to analyze situations, work things out and generate new ideas. So is this actually the Anthropocene now, and it's just a case of just most people just need to wake up to it? In terms of the way that mass society enters into it, I suppose we must enter it somehow, and perhaps the ball will get rolling when people see how the situation corresponds to the need to reform the institutions it created in the Holocene. So, so we need to learn to identify what these are and what the issues are, and in what proportions we should be seeing things change, or at least we should be expecting and be prepared for things to change because of the change in the dynamics of our times. So, that is, in the Holocene, people believe it's acceptable just to be living in evolving civilizations, and then we come into the Anthropocene, and suddenly we have to share a planet, and suddenly creating an empire that wants to invade everyone else isn't acceptable anymore. So people have to cope with the issues involved, and hopefully we can convert the people that are still living according to the values of the Holocene, or according to movements, social movements which appeared in the 20th century, which are no longer relevant to the way that the structure of today's society is evolving. And I'm sure that if we could fill them in, then they would realize, they would see the change, and they would understand where they can go in all this. So currently Finland is criticising the UN Security Council, saying that no country should be able to veto international law. So what we're looking at now is the sort of change which we saw, maybe the size of sort of change that we saw after World War II, in which people had to incorporate the new Cold War spy culture, the age of the superpowers, the rise of clandestine government agencies, marketing concepts like discrete exclusivity, whereas say like the booming 20s, the 1920s was all about consumption, which was so kind of openly kind of, we've evolved out of poverty now, we're proud of this, everyone have a good time, it's everything for everyone, and that wasn't the value then. In the Cold War, it was a kind of embarrassment about having wealth, and it was about the need to cover up what created communism. And things like the Bond movie franchise, things that show the heroism found in capitalism, and the need to understand our own traditional values in order to preserve our way of life, and then at the same time then the communist countries talk about the collective as preserving their way of life. So currently Finland criticising the UN Security Council, saying basically if they do break international law, they should have their voting rights revoked. So once again, we can see the world order issue in play, as leading US politicians such as Jared Kushner are behind Trump's plan to openly support the destruction of Gaza by Israel, which has been in the news, and turn it into the Riviera of the East, in which real estate there becomes a valuable asset for them. And it's no big secret that Trump's in the real estate business. So anyway, it's quite logical that the UN is responding to this current situation with a defensive strategy, protecting itself and its core values, which are obviously needed to bring the change the world needs, while the deep divides in geopolitics are causing wars around the world. However, having to shield itself from the latest fallout between its own superpowers is preventing reform to the system it created itself, which gave the big five superpowers the ability to act autonomously and veto the advice of other nations. Plausible deniability is their motto when it comes to taking responsibility for the crises they make around the world, as they find themselves into competition with each other for resources and creating increasingly authoritarian governmental systems to cope with the types of societies this produces. Once again, the conspiracy theorists point their finger at ancient religions, secret Bible codes, and symbolism on the US dollar. All that needs to happen is the economy just needs to work fast enough to keep the crisis from settling in too long in one place at one time and generating opposition to the global system in general. The problem here is that the current system has to evolve faster than the crises which it creates. But how did that happen, that deflecting attention away from the Ukraine war through the creation of another one has led to the complete entry of the world, it seems, into a completely new phase? Has nobody noticed this? So they've almost completely destroyed a whole country, and it shows that the superpowers are still acting their own interests while at the same time keeping world peace intact on behalf of the UN. Is this where the issue of terrorism ends up, because of people's inability to understand how it's evolved out of the structure of civilization? To understand it now, perhaps as part of the Islamic revolution, is the best that we can do. That is, having risen out of the problem of the shape global civilization has made as it evolved. But what about those people in the social systems who are suffering from the problem, while the rest of the world's people just look on without being able to act, and seeing people just like themselves with businesses, families, communities, and no involvement in terrorist activities or organizations, with their country completely destroyed and being forced to live in tents on a beach, while governments are talking about turning it into real estate? So not to mention the fact that this is a new form of slavery for the government employees who are forbidden to act and forced to uphold systems, government agencies, and spies who are blindly serving a semi-conscious system which is completely corrupted by people who above them know what's happening but run the system through an omission of facts. So that is, they're only allowed to find out more about the big picture as they're promoted up through the levels of the system, each time gaining oversight over a new team and eventually whole departments, and given additional information and training courses on how to manage larger sections of the population. So this means people can get incredibly high up the system without really having any idea of the big picture. And that's incredibly dangerous in terms of the type, not just in terms of the responsibilities that they need to have, but also in terms of the responsibilities which they could be lacking if that's allowed to occur. And I think we've seen all the great genocides happen in this way, where somebody that's not qualified or educated is allowed up into a position in the system which they literally have no idea about the implications of how they're managing things. So are we going to let the shape of our own societies trap us in a new type of society, which is really what novels like George Orwell's Animal Farm and 1984 are all about? And really what we need to do, though, is keep the system running to supply electricity, water and government services to enormous populations. So really what should be happening, I think, or the tendency, what is going to be happening, is probably ones that are more educated or stronger as people will be acting to ensure the well-being of citizens. But surely we need a solution, and that's why I believe that how the rise of the Anthropocene is going to occur, because we need it to happen to solve the problems that we have now. And it's just taken so long to actually get into a phase in which it's possible to promote the politics of that. I know the global system is kept compartmentalized for the sake of national security. After all, what if a level 1 gained knowledge of top secret operations which could endanger lives? Crucial information can be kept in certain hands where its safety can be guaranteed, but this is no reason why most people should not be allowed to know how the world works in a general sense. Back to the NVQ system again, studying for different levels of employment, including management, can be used as a reason to find all this stuff out, because we have, say we know level 1 is entry, we work on different tasks or processes within, say, a factory or government department, and then we can get a promotion to level 2, having become part of the business of organization. We are still somewhat naive about how the whole thing works, but we've been vetted and we were allowed to see all the things which are going on that level. So then we can move up to the level of managing those things and training other people to do what we've just learned to do. So then level 3, here we encountered their managers, which, just like level 1, then as the worker gets familiar with the different processes in the place which they're managing, then they get familiar with the level 2 to all managers of all the different processes. So then they come into a more general sort of manager that's more specialized in management, and he's trained by somebody that is trained specially in management. So that would be the level 4. So then level 5 is about leadership in the organization. So of course the kind of abstract direction or values of the institution are directed to the management specialists. And level 6 would be then the rules and regulations which everybody is bound by, which need to be there to comply with government laws. And then so the level 7s are really the big kind of bosses of departments, and level 8 is concerned with the strategic management of the organization. So it's not difficult really to understand how a business works its way up to the boardroom if you just imagine that it's selling coat hangers, for example. So anyway, we can see that the world order issue does come into life, but it doesn't seem to come into the workplace until a certain point, because that's why we pick the people who we want to work for our business, because they fit in already. But then what needs to change really is people need to be able to learn and adapt more, and then society will be less divided. During the polar phase, we've seen a closer feedback loop between administrations and citizenships. And like I said, this loop's getting closer together. So people are becoming more able to work together. And this is making the world a better place, even though some people find it quite intrusive. But if change can only come from within the system, then this is the very definition of dystopia. It must involve people across all levels of society and not just the ones within the system. And that's why I think that this shift to the Anthropocene could be so chaotic, because that's what's going to happen. Is it's just going to happen at random, and we're not even going to know where we are with it unless there is some kind of government study and some kind of department responsible for kind of measuring, I suppose, the point that we're at with it. And then this will become the new age that we move into after post-modernity. With environmental activist Greta Thunberg on the flotilla, how can we now not say the issue of political economy and the environment are not interlinked? Well, this is why we need to look into the way the situation came into existence in order to understand it properly. But because of the deep divides within geopolitics, people seem to be very slow at clinging to one side or the other to varying degrees. So it seems that people are afraid to look anywhere beneath the surface of the world system because of the deep potholes which exist there in terms of how it actually functions. The knowledge of the acknowledgement of Palestine as a nation, it seems very similar to the way that the multipolar phase was created as the solution to the problem which caused terrorism. And I know you can even find holes in this argument, as it could be argued that it's a very different situation. But if you look at where the continuity is in terms of how the world order has evolved, you can see why. So we might argue about what the different courses of action from here actually might be, but we can all see really that the real problem is the phases that we're going through and how one leads to the next. Exactly, we don't know where things are going, but there are people who are managing the situation, who are very high up in government, who do have maps and plans of the way the current situation is developing and where all the government operations are and how they all relate to each other. So they do have meetings, and the UN does know what's happening. So it seems the multipolar phase will lead to a new type of globalism. I said in the last video about having the world moving forward in a particular way, and I think that because this has been true, people have come to the point where they feel that they must start questioning why it is happening, simply because of the way the whole ideas process evolves. Gradually over time, governments are made to explain themselves more and become increasingly accountable, as through their hard work people are in a position to demand a better standard of living, and people in authority have less raw power. But maybe at the same time, the world system's slowing down as a result of this. And what we need to do is keep enough raw power in the system in order to keep it moving forward. So most people are ignoring these crises and keep fueling the system, which causes them to happen with investment and labour, as it provides most people's means of survival. But from the global support we are now seeing from people in Palestine, it seems that we've crossed the line in terms of the way people see the acceptability of problems with the way the world system works should not simply be allowed to boil over into regional crises, which can destroy whole nations.